So I want you to think about the morning of September 14th, 2008.
Oh, yeah. Right before the crash.
Exactly. Or, if you want to go further back, think about the height of the Roman Empire, right before the crisis of the 3rd century.
Right.
Because right at the exact millisecond, a dominant superpower or a massive financial cartel or a seemingly invincible tech monopoly boasts to the world that it is completely untouchable.
That it's too big to fail.
Yes, too big to fail. That is almost always the exact moment the floor completely falls out.
It really is.
You look at these systems from the outside, and they have the thickest concrete walls. They have, like, armies of Ivy League analysts. They have algorithms that practically predict the future and just endless capital.
Right. It looks like a mountain.
It does. It looks permanent. And then, over a weekend, the entire thing shatters.
Well, it is the ultimate historical illusion. We have this hardwired cognitive bias, I think, where we equate size and complexity with security. You stand in front of a massive institution, or you look at a global supply chain that spans 50 countries, and you just assume permanence.
Right, because it's big.
Exactly. You assume that because something is highly complex and heavily resourced, it automatically possesses structural integrity.
But when you actually apply the ruthless mechanics of sociology or, systems engineering to that assumption, that facade of permanence completely dissolves.
It vanishes.
It really does. So today we are opening up a stack of notes and a translated lecture transcript that operates as basically a 1,400-year-old diagnostic manual for civilizational survival.
A fascinating text.
Yeah, it really is. We're going to do a deep dive into Surah Al-Ankabut, specifically Ayat 38 through 44. And I want to be clear here. We're looking at this text strictly through the lens of structural sociology.
Right. No theology today.
Zero. We are stripping away any traditional religious sentimentality to look at the absolute raw mechanics of what this text is stating about human systems.
And the text hands us a central defining thesis right in the middle of that section, in Ayat 29.41.
It really is the anchor of the whole thing.
It is. It provides a signature image that slices right through all of that surface-level grandeur we just talked about.
What does it say exactly?
The text says, "The likeness of those who take protectors besides God is the likeness of the spider that builds a house, and the frailest of houses is the spider's house, if only they knew."
Okay, I want to frame the terminology here for you, the listeners, so we have a clear analytical baseline. Because when the text references God in this specific sociological context, we're talking about the fundamental objective governing law of nature.
Right, the real laws of physics and sociology.
Exactly, the ultimate, unalterable reality of the universe. What this text posits is that any social, economic, or political order built on something other than those real load-bearing laws of human reality is a spider's web.
It might look incredibly elaborate.
Oh, sure. It might have stunning geometric complexity. But it holds absolutely zero structural strength against a real force. It holds exactly until it is touched.
Yeah, and the brilliance of that diagnostic tool is how the text actually sets it up. It doesn't just, drop the spider metaphor into a vacuum.
Right, it gives context.
Exactly. In the verses immediately preceding it, so Ayat 38 through 40, the text lays out the historical field evidence.
It builds a case.
It really does. It presents this heavily curated list of collapsed giants. It points to the ancient civilizations of Ad and Thamud.
The heavy hitters of antiquity.
Right. And it points to the vast, unregulated wealth hoarding of a figure named Qarun. It points to the absolute political monopoly of Pharaoh and the vast military bureaucratic complex of his minister, Haman.
Okay, I hear that list. Pharaoh, Ad, Thamud. And my immediate reaction, probably yours too, listener, is to just relegate them to the category of ancient myths.
Right. Dusty history.
Exactly. We picture people in sandals walking around primitive mud huts. But to understand the systems engineering taking place in this text, we have to translate what those names represented to the world at that time.
They were not primitive.
Not at all. These are the absolute apex predators of their era. Pharaoh wasn't just some guy with a crown. His system was a totalizing, top-down command economy.
A massive machine.
And Qarun wasn't just a rich merchant. He represented an unregulated financial cartel that extracted wealth from the lower classes without producing any actual societal value.
Right, a parasite on the system.
Exactly.
Wow.
These were the untouchable superpowers of their day.
And they had completely conquered their environments. The text is addressing an audience, the Arabs of that era, who literally traveled their major trade highways from Yemen to Syria.
Right, they saw the ruins.
They walked directly through the physical ruins of these empires. The text relies on that archaeological reality.
It's pointing to the evidence.
Yeah, it's pointing to the massive carved mountains of Thamud, the vast hydraulic engineering of Ad, the monumental stone architecture of Egypt.
So they possessed immense data.
They had complex economies and staggering physical infrastructure.
But wait, if we are talking about fragility and collapse, let's be real for a second. The pyramids of Giza are literally some of the most permanent structures ever created by human hands.
Oh, absolutely.
They are still standing millennia later. The aqueducts, the carved mountains in Petra, they outlasted the empires.
Right.
So how can the text call these systems fragile when their physical infrastructure literally outlasted them by thousands of years? Doesn't the physical survival of those stones contradict the idea that their house was frail?
That is actually the exact distinction the text is making. It's differentiating between physical engineering and sociological engineering.
Oh, interesting. Unpack that.
Well, the stones are still standing because the architects of Pharaoh and Thamud understood the objective laws of physics. They understood gravity. They understood load-bearing architecture.
Friction, leverage, all of that.
Right. When they built a pyramid, they aligned it perfectly with the immutable laws of nature. Therefore, the physical structure survived.
Makes sense.
But the societal structure, the economic model of slave labor, the hoarding of resources, the political tyranny, that system was not aligned with the objective laws of human sociology.
Ah, I see.
It was built on false dependencies. So while the physical stones obeyed the laws of physics and stood firm, the society violated the laws of human reality and completely evaporated.
Wow. That completely reframes the ruins. The ruins aren't just old buildings. They're the ultimate sociological data point.
Exactly. They are a warning.
They scream out a very specific warning. Massive GDP, technological advancement, and monumental physical infrastructure do not equal systemic permanence.
Right. You can't buy permanence with stone.
You can engineer the tallest skyscraper in the world or build the most complex global logistics network, but if the societal foundation running it is flawed, the sheer size of the operation just guarantees that the inevitable collapse will be that much more catastrophic.
Which is why the transition the text makes in Ayat 41 is so intellectually jarring.
The shift to the spider.
Right. It moves from pointing at these massive, terrifying monuments of stone and empire to pointing at one of the most delicate things in the natural world.
It's a huge contrast.
Let's look at the linguistic breakdown of this metaphor to see how it deconstructs the illusion of the solid establishment.
Yes, let's get into the linguistics, because if we are diagnosing bad foundations, why a spider's web? Why not say they built a house of sand or, I don't know, a house of dry leaves?
Right. Those are the usual tropes.
Exactly. Those are universally understood symbols of things that fall apart. There has to be a specific structural reason the text uses a spider.
The Arabic uses three very specific terms here. First, Al-Ankabut, the spider itself. Second, the word bait, meaning a house or an established structure.
Okay.
And third, Awana al-Bayt, the absolute most fragile, the weakest of all possible structures.
So why not sand?
Well, a house of sand or a house of leaves doesn't work for this metaphor because a pile of sand has no illusion of systemic complexity. You look at a pile of sand and you know it's just a pile of sand.
Right, there's no trick.
But a spider's web is a masterpiece of deception. If you just look at the schematics of a web, it is a marvel of apparent functionality.
It has nodes, it has intersecting networks.
Built-in redundancy.
Yeah, it's geometrically brilliant. On a day-to-day basis, if you are the spider, that web looks like an impregnable fortress. And if you are a fly, it looks like an inescapable trap.
It is a highly functional system.
Highly functional, highly complex, but possessing zero load-bearing capacity against anything outside its immediate microscopic environment.
Exactly. The web is constructed from threads that possess incredible tensile strength for their weight, but they cannot bear a macro load.
A gentle breeze, a falling leaf.
A sudden change in temperature or a single swipe of a hand, and that entire complex geometric system is instantly obliterated. The text is stating that these ancient empires, much like modern megacorporations or bloated financial markets, built massive, complex webs. They relied on things the text calls aliyah.
Aliyah. Now that is typically translated as patrons or protectors or false gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a systems engineering context, what does that actually look like?
In a systemic context, aliyah are the false dependencies your system relies on. They are the unproven ideologies, the corrupt economic models.
Like the reliance on endless infinite growth on a finite planet.
Exactly. They are the assumption that you can continually extract labor from an underclass without eventual blowback.
Right.
These civilizations built their entire operational models assuming these false protectors would hold the weight of their society.
But they couldn't.
No, because an ideology based on exploitation cannot protect a society from the objective natural laws of social decay. It is mathematically impossible.
Let's apply that to a modern context so you, the listener, can really map this out. Imagine a global tech company whose entire business model relies on a single, unregulated supply chain half a world away.
A very common scenario.
Right. And they assume energy costs will remain cheap forever. The protector, the Aliyah, is the assumption of endless cheap shipping and zero geopolitical friction.
Right, that's their false god.
For a decade, it works beautifully. The stock goes up, the logistics network looks like a gorgeous, complex spiderweb of efficiency. But the threads holding it together have no load-bearing strength.
And then reality hits.
The second a global pandemic hits, or a canal gets blocked, or a geopolitical conflict erupts, the web tears. The complexity didn't save them. In fact, the complexity was exactly what made them so fragile to begin with.
And you know what the immediate defense is? The defense you hear from historians or even modern market analysts when these systems fail is this appeal to intellect.
Oh yeah, they were so smart.
Exactly. But they were so advanced. They had the best minds, the best data. The source text actually anticipates this exact defense.
Oh really? Where?
In Ayat 29.43, it states, "These parables we set forth for people, but none comprehend them except those who know," using the word alaman. The text establishes the spider's web not as a piece of dramatic poetry, but as a rigid analytical model. It is a predictive law.
But this brings up a massive contradiction. I call it the ultimate intellect trap. Because if we go back to Pharaoh or Qarun or any of these dominant systems, didn't they have scientists?
Of course they did.
Didn't Pharaoh employ master architects and brilliant military strategists? These weren't ignorant societies.
Just far from it.
So if they possessed all this immense data and logistical brilliance, how could they possibly be so blind to the fact that they were building a spiderweb?
This is where the source transcript delivers perhaps its most profound sociological insight. It explicitly categorizes these destroyed, collapsed nations as mustabsirin.
Mustabsirin. What does that actually mean in this context?
It means people of deep insight, people possessing powerful perceptual tools, eyes, ears, cognitive processing. The source refers to this as possessing immense perceptual knowledge.
So they were swimming in data.
Exactly. They knew exactly how to measure the flooding of the Nile, how to calculate the trajectory of stars, how to engineer complex financial instruments.
They had the charts and the graphs.
They possessed massive raw intellect. But the text introduces a severe foundational critique of classical philosophy, specifically the Socratic assertion that knowledge is virtue.
Wow, okay. Because that Socratic idea is still the bedrock of our modern world.
Absolutely.
We operate on the absolute unquestioned belief that if we just acquire enough data, if we just build a fast enough supercomputer or deploy enough machine learning algorithms, we will automatically solve our civilizational problems.
We treat data as the savior.
We really do.
Well, the source material completely dismantles that belief. Mere perceptual knowledge is entirely insufficient for survival.
It's not enough on its own.
Raw intellect is just a tool, an engine. It is a neutral amplifier. If you possess incredible engineering knowledge, but the underlying goal of your society is the hoarding of wealth by an elite class, your knowledge doesn't stop the exploitation.
It just accelerates it.
Yes. It just allows you to build a hyper-efficient machine for exploitation. You don't build a sustainable load-bearing structure. You just build a much larger, much deadlier spiderweb.
So if having a massive intellect and endless data isn't enough to save a society from collapse, what is the missing variable? How does this framework define actual functional wisdom?
To understand the missing variable, the lecture transcript dives deeply into the linguistic root of the Arabic word for intellect, which is aql.
Aql, okay.
And this etymology fundamentally shifts the paradigm. Historically, for the ancient Bedouin Arabs, the aql was the heavy, physical rope they used to tie a camel's knee.
Wait, a camel's knee?
Yes. When you are out in the harsh desert, a camel is your most valuable asset, your engine of survival. But if you don't tie its knee at night, it will wander off into the dark, get lost, or trample your camp.
A physical rope tying down a massive beast. That is a radically different way to conceptualize human cognition.
It really is.
We usually think of intellect as something that sets us free, something that lets our minds soar. But here, the root of intellect is about restriction. It's about binding something down.
Precisely. True intellectual in this systemic framework is not the ability to innovate faster or calculate variables. It is the ability to tie down raw, unbridled human power.
Lying it down to what, exactly?
It is the rope that binds human greed, aggressive tribalism, and exploitative desires to permanent, objective, constructive values.
Oh, that makes sense.
Let's say you have a society with staggering technological power, a massive, incredibly strong camel. If you have no alcohol, no ethical rope tying that technological power to the actual benefit of humanity, that power will inevitably run wild.
Right, it's unleashed.
It will extract, it will consume, and it will eventually trample the very camp that created it.
Let me put that in the context we see today.
Yeah.
Think about a modern social media conglomerate optimizing its algorithms for maximum user engagement.
The perfect example.
The engineering teams there possess off-the-charts perceptual knowledge. They are mustabsirin. They run millions of A/B tests. They track eye movements. They know exactly how dopamine receptors fire in the human brain.
They have all the data.
They have built an incredibly complex, geometrically perfect spiderweb. But they have absolutely zero AQL.
Right.
There is no rope tying that algorithm to the mental health of the users or the social cohesion of the country. They are maximizing engagement by feeding rage and division. The intellect is massive, but because there is no load-bearing ethical foundation, the system begins to fracture the society it operates in.
And that leads directly to the question of mechanics.
Yes, how does it actually break?
Right. If a society is highly intelligent, highly advanced, but operating without AQL, building an elaborate web of false dependencies, how does the collapse actually happen?
That's the core question, right?
Yeah.
Because when you look at history or even modern corporate failures, the sky doesn't usually open up and strike the CEO with lightning.
No, it doesn't.
It's not some mythological wrecking ball swinging down from the heavens. If we are treating this as systems engineering, what is the actual mechanism of the fall?
The source text introduces the principle of mukafat-e-amal, which translates to the law of requital. And it pairs this systemic principle with the linguistic reality of the word zombie.
Now, anyone who has read translated religious text has encountered the word zombie.
Oh, yeah.
It almost universally gets translated as sin. And when we hear sin, we immediately picture a cosmic judge tallying up moral demerits on a clipboard, waiting to issue an emotional punishment. It carries all this heavy arbitrary baggage.
Exactly. But the source transcript strips all of that theological baggage entirely away. It focuses on the linguistic root.
Which is?
In Arabic, zombie literally means a tail. The tail of an animal, like a cow or a horse.
A tail. Like physically an animal's tail.
Yes. Think about the physical reality of tail. It is physically, structurally attached to the spine of the animal. Wherever the animal goes, the tail inevitably tracks right behind it.
You can't leave it behind.
You cannot separate the cow from its tail. The concept being deployed here is that an inevitable structural consequence tracks right behind a specific action. The consequence is physically attached to the choice.
So if an architect decides to build a massive suspension bridge out of dried pasta.
Terrible idea.
Right. And then a fleet of semi-trucks drives over it. The bridge shattering into a million pieces is not a punishment for the sin of bad engineering. The universe isn't angry at the architect.
No, not at all.
The collapse is simply the zombie. It is the tail. The failure is structurally attached to the act of building with an inadequate material.
That is the exact mechanism. Structural fragility is the punishment.
Wow.
When Ayat 38 through 40 lists those fallen civilizations and describes how each one was seized, it was simply the system meeting a natural moment of stress.
It wasn't an arbitrary smiting.
Not at all. It might have been a severe drought, an unexpected economic shock, a disruption in trade routes, or a social uprising from an exploited underclass.
The stress test just revealed the web.
The consequence is entirely structural. If you design a political or economic system relying on false protectors on Alia, the eventual collapse isn't a risk that might happen. It is an active, guaranteed property of the design.
The text even says they wronged themselves.
Yeah.
That is such a vital pivot in how we analyze failure. You aren't waiting around for some external auditor or cosmic judge to shut your corrupt institution down.
No, you're doing it to yourself.
The corruption itself is actively hollowing out the foundation. It is like designing a commercial airplane without factoring in aerodynamics. And then when it plummets out of the sky, you blame gravity for being cruel.
Right. Gravity wasn't angry.
Gravity is just a constant. The law of requital is simply the sociological equivalent of gravity.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate question. This brings us to the synthesis in Ayat 29.44.
Let's hear it.
We have spent all this time diagnosing the bad engineering. We know that a system built on false dependencies, operating with immense perceptual knowledge but no ACL, inevitably triggers its own collapse.
The tail catches up to the cow.
Exactly. So what is the alternative? If the spider's web is the substitute order, what does a real load-bearing order actually look like?
How do you build a structure that actually survives the stress test?
The text answers this in Ayat 44, stating that God created the heavens and the earth in truth. The Arabic phrase used is bil-haq.
Bil-haq.
Now, keeping our strict sociological lens, what does it mean to build a society bil-haq? The source transcript contrasts two fundamentally opposed worldviews.
Let's lay out the first one.
The first is a completely secular, purposeless view of the universe. In this paradigm, existence is just a massive physical machine. It has no ultimate objective, no evolutionary destination.
Just a giant clockwork.
Right. It's just a collection of gears grinding against each other, wearing down over time. In a universe like that, the only logical rule is the law of the jungle.
Survival of the fittest.
Exploit before you are exploited. Accumulate as much raw power and wealth as quickly as possible.
Because if there is no objective truth, if there is no inherent purpose, you might as well just optimize for short-term personal gain.
It's the only rational choice in that system.
That is the exact operating system of Qarun hoarding his wealth, or Pharaoh enslaving a population. You spin the biggest spiderweb you can, you trap as many resources as possible, and who cares if it blows away tomorrow, as long as you today.
But the bil-haq worldview operates on a completely different set of physics. It posits that the universe is not a random, purposeless machine.
It has a direction.
It asserts that existence has an objective trajectory. It operates on permanent, immutable values. Therefore, a human system, whether it's a government, a financial market, or a community, is only structurally sound if it aligns with that actual trajectory.
So what does alignment look like? What makes a societal wall load-bearing?
According to the source analysis, alignment means designing systems that prioritize the actual benefit and development of all humanity, not just catering to the exploitative desires of a tiny elite.
It has to serve everyone.
If an economic model is designed to elevate human dignity, to distribute resources equitably, to actively tie down raw corporate or political power with the ACL of permanent ethical values, then that system is built by bil-haq.
It actually has integrity.
It possesses actual tensile strength.
Because when the inevitable moment of stress arrives, when the drought hits or the market crashes or the pandemic sweeps across the globe, a society built bil-haq doesn't shatter.
It flexes, but it holds.
Its internal dependencies are real. The population trusts the institutions because the institutions serve the population. The resources are distributed so the lower levels don't buckle under the weight.
The foundation is solid rock because it is aligned with human reality.
That is the core diagnostic takeaway for anyone analyzing the world today. We have to understand the dynamic between permanence and change.
It's crucial.
A fundamental, prominent principle of civilizational survival has not altered a single degree since the era of Ad and Thamud.
Not one bit.
A system built on false protectors, a system reliant on exploitation or infinite unchecked growth, is the frailest of houses. It does not matter how staggering its GDP is or how dominant its military footprint appears.
Only alignment with real governing laws provides structural strength. That is the permanence.
And the change. The change is just the aesthetics. It's just the shape of the web.
Exactly. The spiders spin completely new patterns every single era.
Yesterday, it was the pharaohs carving their faces into stone and the ancient trade cartels controlling the spice routes.
Right.
Today, it might be an unhinged technological empire operating without any ethical tether, or a massive corporate monopoly that looks like an unstoppable force of nature, or a hollow political ideology built purely on fracturing a population to maintain power.
They wear different clothes.
They use fiber optic cables instead of chariots. But structurally, architecturally, they are identical.
And as Ayat 41 observes with such chilling precision, they know not.
They have no idea.
They genuinely believe they are standing inside an impregnable fortress, completely unaware that they are just suspended in a fragile web, entirely exposed to the elements.
They possess all the data in the world. They're a mustabzarin, but they lack the fundamental structural awareness to see their own fragility.
So true.
So, as you, the listener, step back out into the world, this text has handed you a profound, high-resolution diagnostic tool.
Use it.
When you are analyzing the massive power structures around you, when you are reading the financial news, when you're watching a dominant political movement sweep the polls, when you are looking at a tech giant reshaping human communication, do not let the grandeur intimidate you.
Look past the concrete.
Do not be hypnotized by the sheer size of the building or the complexity of the operation. Stop measuring the concrete. Test the threads.
Ask yourself, are the underlying dependencies load-bearing? Is this system built by Al-Haq, designed for the elevation and benefit of humanity?
Or is it built on exploitation, false promises, and the assumption that the music will never stop playing?
Because if it is built on false protectors, the law of requital is already in motion. The tail is already attached to the action.
The structural failure is already written into the code. It is merely waiting for the wind to blow.
Exactly.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, and this requires turning that diagnostic lens inward. Look past the massive empires and look at the systems you actively rely on in your own life.
That's the hard part.
It is. Look at the trajectory of your career. Look at the financial systems you pour your savings into. Look at the institutions you place your blind trust in and the social networks you dedicate your time to.
Bring it home.
Ask yourself the hard systems engineering question. Are you standing on a foundation built on objective permanent value? Or have you comfortably settled inside a highly complex, beautifully woven spider's web, simply waiting for the first real stress test to arrive? Because if we have learned anything from the ruins of Ad, Thamud, and the empires of yesterday, it is this. Just because you can't see the structural failure yet doesn't mean the stress fractures aren't already there. Take a very close look at your threads.